Protesters are also demonstrating against police violence. Over 2,000 people have been detained in recent weeks for participating in unsanctioned protests. Some say they were beaten by police and had to be hospitalized for their injuries. Julia Chapman joins us now from Moscow. Julia, tell us more on what's happening on the ground right now. We understand a group of protesters apparently tried to move the rally to the presidential administration building. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Some people were trying to gather there, and now they're here in central Moscow, trying to gather in the streets out behind me. We've had to come into a metro underpass because the police presence is so heavy outside. They're completely blocking the road, the square around us here, so it's been impossible to get out onto the streets and move around. They've been detaining a number of people, at least 100 here in Moscow, and that number is expected to rise over the next few hours as these protesters are gathering now in places that they weren't initially authorized to be. So that protest earlier that garnered 50,000 people, those that had been authorized by the authorities, they said that they had permission to gather there. That went by peacefully for just over 2 hours because that was all the time they were given to gather there. People started dispersing, and then they moved down here into central Moscow where they've been trying to gather again and have been met with a very heavy hand from riot police here who've been arresting people. We've seen several arrests ourselves. One man we saw was being dragged by his ponytail as he resisted being arrested by riot police.
Now, this is the 5th consecutive weekend of protests, we understand. Is it likely to persuade authorities, though, to bow to these protesters' demands, though?
It's very unlikely that they will have any effect, but they certainly do seem to have touched a nerve because the police presence has been so heavy today and in previous weeks. We saw in the last couple of weeks, each Saturday there was a protest that was not sanctioned by authorities, and more than 1,000 people were arrested at each of those. So there does seem to be quite a heavy hand from the authorities. They do seem to be worried about these protests. They don't want to see people gathering on the streets of Moscow, and that's why they've cracked down so hard. But many people say, why not just let these opposition candidates participate in the local elections? Many of them were polling with very low numbers. They were unlikely to get elected to the Moscow City Duma, a position that doesn't actually have that much power in the first place. So people are saying that the reaction has been very disproportionate here ahead of these elections.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. Julia Chapman there speaking to us from Moscow, Russia.